Afternoon, Dave, and it's a real pleasure to be back on again.
It's my pleasure to have you back on here. And last time we talked about the economy, the geopolitical events, and I wanted to start off today with Putin because he made this speech about their superior weapon systems, and he was out there telling the world that, he has missile systems that can fly anywhere, hit any target around the world. And I wanted to get your take on why he made this speech now. Why was it so important, and who was he speaking to? So why did he make this speech at this point in time?
Wow, well, before anyone starts to listen, this is a big, huge section, so we'll try and not go too quick with it. I mean, I've spoken for a long time that there isn't any time date, or dates in terms of how things will happen. It's an event-driven scenario. Now, there are certain points within this event-driven scenario that are what I call major inflection points in the move towards this new paradigm, a multipolar world, and really the end of the Cabal Empire. Now, people who've known me and have obviously listened to previous X-22 interviews, we've spoken for many years about how Russia's military technology is light years ahead of the US and its NATO partners. Now, a lot of people dismissed this as Russian propaganda and utter nonsense. And even when Russia began to sort of showcase this new technology in Syria, I think few recognized that perhaps there was mileage in the assertion that Russia did have advanced technologies that in reality the West could, logically only dream of. But I think when the US military took the threat to sink the entire US fleet in the South China Sea seriously, I think eyes began to be raised not only in Washington. So when Putin makes his speech to the lawmakers in Moscow, it was very much a calculated move, and not, as the West believed, was to galvanize a nation behind him just prior to the presidential elections, because frankly it was a given he was going to win, and the fact he ended up winning by the largest majority I think he's had in all the elections that he's taken part in. So it was very much what I would term a strategic move on the chessboard of this event-driven scenario. And it was expected to result in sort of predictable and unpredictable actions via Washington, NATO partners, and also the Kabbalists and what I call their sycophantic sort of minions. I mean, we can go into North Korea in more detail later, but in a very broad sense, these are the kind of reactions that came as a result of Putin's speech. Well, firstly, North Korea's rapprochement towards South Korea, and Washington. It came at this time, and I think it's no coincidence. And maybe to some extent, it was one of the less expected triggers at this time. For sure, I think it was coming down the track. But I think the Putin address accelerated this development, and in the process, it's thrown this huge curveball in the direction of the cabal and the neocons in Washington. We can also maybe talk a bit later, see how we go for time. I think the timing of the Skripal poisoning in the UK is arguably not a coincidence either. I mean, just in a very broad sense, questions were asked about whether the nerve agent was even used, given there were reports from a medic who attended to Skripal and his daughter. There was no evidence of nerve agent on their face and body, and the medic didn't subsequently suffer any ill effects, which is reason enough to doubt the aspect of the official narrative. But let's not go into too much detail. However, you set aside the enormous flaws in the so-called investigation and the narrative peddled by the UK government. But what this whole affair has done is highlight deficiencies in the credibility of the UK government, and the media is now coming sharply into focus in the process. So there are kind of one of those situations when governments in the West go after the Russians and try to accuse them of things, it always blows up in their face. Yeah, and we're seeing that again. But what's also clear is there's desperation that's filling the corridors of Westminster, which is the Parliament, and Whitehall, which is kind of the real seat of power in the UK. And when the UK Defence Secretary came out and said Russia should go away and shut up, it was damning and telling. So I think the fear is now palpable, as is the desperation, because when Whitehall and Washington are now recognising that Russia's this dominant global military power, and the UK and the US is now a sitting duck. And the irony, of course, is I think they thought the Skripal affair would backfire on Putin. It only galvanized and enhanced his support. And this toothless act of expelling diplomats, I think, is farcical and meaningless. But what is absolutely clear in all these actions is that, and it will have long-term and highly damaging consequences for the UK both economically, given Russia's, what they call these so-called oligarchs have financially propped up London for many years, but it's going to damage US-Chinese relations in the process. Now, I think another consequential effect of this was these kind of suddenly where we saw certain key figures in the US administration leaving. I mean, the removal of Tillerson was one example. And for me, we've said it before, it was never a good move. It's kind of clear that his stance on the likes of Syria, Iran, and North Korea were conflicting with people inside the Trump administration. The only thing, the silver lining, is his strong relations with China and Russia remain intact, and he's afforded great respect. And I think in that regard, Tillerson will remain a key player, whether he was inside Washington or operating outside and on the periphery. Now, in terms of new personnel, there's been a lot of people concerned about the likes of Pompeo. Now, people who subscribe to our podcast know that back in October, I suggested that that Tillerson was going to be replaced and that Pompeo was the likely person to succeed him. Now, obviously, subsequently, that's come to pass. Now, the rationale with Pompeo is he's seen as someone who can seamlessly move into the position and is someone who Trump is in regular contact with on all manner of issues. I think the one difference is Pompeo's always been in Trump's inner circle and Tillerson, I think, arguably never was. Now, in terms of Pompeo's appointment, there are obvious concerns with regards to some of the public persona in the past over issues such as Iran and Syria. But we need to place this in the context of developments during his tenure as kind of director of the CIA. Because what I'm aware of is that US officials have been to Damascus to discuss security concerns with Syrian security chiefs, and Pompeo has established strong back channels with the security chiefs. And his stance on a number of matters have caused a lot of consternation amongst the ranks of the CIA. I mean, there are elements within the Langley who believe that Pompeo moved way beyond what you would term acceptable boundaries between the CIA and the White House. And in fact, Pompeo was not towing the Langley line, whereby, it became sort of apparent that he was distancing himself from officials and policy matters inside the agency. So this is very contradictory to most people's perspective of Pompeo. And one of the greatest examples was when Pompeo stated publicly that the US intelligence had determined that Moscow's intervention didn't impact the outcome of the election. This was a telling departure from the official narrative. There are also allegations about a lack of cooperation with the CIA that caused roadblocks in the Mueller investigation, which we don't need to go into any detail about that. And Pompeo hit back at critics who raised concerns about, meetings between the US and the Russian intelligence officials, whereby Russian Foreign Intelligence Service chiefs actually held talks with US counterparts on US soil. This is the reality of what happens in the world. Ignore all the rhetoric out there. But, both nations are gunning for each other and World War III is about to happen. These kind of conversations happen regularly, and it's why we all go to bed in the evening, wake up in the evening, and the world seemingly hasn't really changed. So in Pompeo's case, it's anything but an open and shut case that he's going to adopt this more aggressive and hardline stance towards the likes of Iran. I mean, obviously we'll have to see what happens, but I think there's a plausible argument it's a calculated move by Trump, which will defy expectation and deliver quite surprising results, which will see the cabal's foreign policy further curtailed. Now, obviously, there's Pompeo's successor, Gina Haspel. There's a lot of concern about that, but she's been in the CIA for over 30 years. People will argue she's been involved in controversial policies. And these are naturally on the basis that there are concerns she might seek to implement such policies going forward. The one thing Haspel is throughout her career, whatever people's perspective is that she's regarded as being trustworthy, loyal. She's not disobeyed orders that were given to her. And there's also suggestions that she might just be going to aggressively clean house in the CIA. And that's why she's being promoted, because she has the attributes to not only undertake that task, but also, is trusted to implicitly do so. I think the other thing is John Bolton's another example. There's a lot of people very scared about his perception on Iran and in terms of Syria and North Korea. Equally, I think it's the old adage, it's better to have your friends close and your enemies closer. And I think having John Bolton inside the White House gives them a better perspective of how people such as him are thinking, what they're feeling, and I think there'll be a strong controlling influence over him. But it remains to be seen what happens. And I think certainly if you look at concerns, I understand why people are concerned what might happen in terms of Iran. But I think overall, it seems maybe a bit long-winded to discuss things, but Putin's speech certainly was this seismic event-driven scenario inflection point, which set off a whole chain reaction in the process. And obviously, we can talk in more detail about North Korea. We can talk in maybe, if we get time, to talk about aspects of Syria without going into too much detail, but there are some interesting points. And it's certainly changed the whole emphasis in the West. And I think it's definitely been the catalyst for why we've had all this foaming at the mouth over the Skripal case and why suddenly apparently Russia's responsible for everything and anything. And it just shows the utter desperation and the idea that they're trying to convince people in the West that there's a reality to this. And meanwhile, nations sort of east of Russia, including Russia, are looking at this whole situation going, this is incredible, absolutely incredible that people are thinking this way and actually genuinely believe there's any reality to it. So that's why I think the timing was everything. And also I suspect, one of the big things that it was also as we say, the push for the petro yuan, and we can talk about that in more detail. So there's a whole raft of reasons why, and the timing was because in this scenario, it was time to flip another domino. And certain things were expected to happen, like the petro yuan, other things, maybe accelerated quicker than was anticipated through North Korea. But also, these administration changes, I think, were a catalyst for this as well in terms of the White House.
Let's talk about the petro yuan since you mentioned it. Now, China came out and they launched their petro yuan futures. A lot of people are saying that, this is going to go up against the petrodollar. The petrodollar is doomed. And we can see right now there is some type of movement towards moving everything from the West to the East. I mean, if we look at China, they have manufacturing, they have the One Belt, One Road, they have the petro yuan, they basically duplicated the payment system out in China. They've been accumulating a lot of gold in China. I mean, when you look at this and you see what is happening out there, is this coincidence that this is just all happening, or was this planned, and is there a specific reason why the petro yuan has been launched, why China and Russia have been doing everything they've been doing? I mean, what is the game plan here for what is happening out in the East?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to start saying that this is really a truly significant, and I would say arguably the biggest single economic event that's happened since Bretton Woods. And I will go as strongly as that. It's a seismic game changer in the event-driven scenario. However, it's a slow burner. But let's put it in simple terms. Traders will be able to purchase oil in yuan instead of US dollars on the Shanghai exchange. And in the process, it marks a huge turning point at the end of US hegemony, and why effectively I call it a thermonuclear economic warhead aimed at the deep state cabal. But in order to understand the magnitude of the adoption of the petro yuan, we need to understand why it's significant. Now, the oil market is by far the biggest market in the world with total sales. I think it's around $1.8 trillion per year. And to put this in comparison, the second biggest global market is gold, which is around $200 billion a year. And of course, what do we need to factor into our understanding is that China is already the world's largest importer of oil. It's around 8.5 million barrels of oil per day, and its consumption is expected to rise by around 10% per year for the foreseeable future. So let's say over the next 5 years or so. Now, what makes the adoption of the petro yuan such an intelligent move is initially China's fully aware that Western traders might be reluctant and not easily influenced to drop the US dollar and accumulate large reserves of the yuan in the process. And that's precisely why they have made the petro yuan directly and easily convertible into gold by what are enormous gold exchanges in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Don't let anyone suggest that's not feasible and possible, because it most certainly will. Now, eventually, what this will mean is that the price of gold and silver, for that matter, will begin to rise as the volumes these trade will generate and preclude kind of the European and US central banks from artificially controlling the gold price as they've been doing so for decades. And what this means is that whoever holds or trades gold in the coming years stands to make rather large gains, irrespective of whether we have inflationary considerations or any other economics, seismic events. And traders kind of already seeing obvious benefits, but don't expect instant results. But it's truly an incendiary device under Western central banks, and they're powerless to do anything about it. And that's why it is a seismic moment in this event-driven scenario. But to put it in context, they started their futures on Monday, and very quickly it became obvious that it was a highly liquid market initially. It was interesting. We saw Glencore execute Shanghai's first crude deal. We had Swiss-based commodity traders Transfigura and Mercuria, and the US-based Freepoint were early participants. I think what's highly indicative of the future is that Shanghai's turnover challenged Brent volumes during Asian hours, and also, I think there was some idea that there's potential for an arbitrage trade with oil markets in the US and Europe. And on the first day, I think there's around 20 million barrels traded. By Wednesday, the volume had increased over 50%, around about 60%. Now, what I find kind of amusing about this, there's people in the West saying, this yuan-denominated trading could stall because of all these regulations and rules that, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange wants to implement. But China offers this potential for this highly deep liquid market. And also it's going to be buoyed by interest from retail investors, because in China they support vast commodities derivatives markets, from everything to iron ore, from wheat, coffee, everything. And this is predominant in Shanghai and places like that. But what it also recognizes is that yuan-denominated contracts are going to help, China's efforts to internationalize the nation's currency. At some point, you're going to have oil majors, like PetroChina and Sinopec, and they're going to provide significant amounts of liquidity in the long term. And also, quite tellingly, is Unipec, who's a trading arm of Sinopec. They signed a deal with an unnamed Western oil major to buy Middle Eastern crude priced against the Shanghai futures contract. And that is pretty significant in the first week. And I expect we'll see many more such oil majors signing similar contracts. And so some big advantage for international traders, because Beijing wants to waive income tax for overseas investors, trading obviously yuan-denominated crude oil futures. Their foreign brokers are going to be exempt from paying income tax on commissions they earn from dealing in the futures contracts. And it's an intelligent move which ultimately will suck, money and trade out of Brent and the WTI markets into China in return for yuan, which is convertible into gold. Now, the question obviously in that regard is, what does this ultimately mean in the long term? Well, if the petro-yuan basically usurps the petrodollar, oil importing nations no longer need dollars. The demand for dollars and treasuries is going to fall off a cliff edge. The US dollar declines, so you get a dollar crisis. You're going to get higher inflation. Interest rates are going to increase, and you're going to have a sovereign private debt crisis in this sort of cyclical approach. So it is hugely seismic, but people shouldn't expect it to happen overnight. But it will be a slow burner, but it's another huge dagger to the heart of the petrodollar and ultimately the death of fiat currencies. And there are some sort of interesting sidelines to this, which ultimately the question is, okay, at what point does Saudi Arabia officially join the petro-yuan and ditch the petrodollar? Now, only very recently we've seen Moscow and Riyadh, backed by OPEC, and they're negotiating a deal to allow them to have long-term control of oil prices. And that when I talk long-term, they're talking about managing oil markets for the next 20 years. Now, they've got some agreement in a broad sense, but not sort of drilled down to the detail. And in a sense, getting an agreement in one sense means Russia almost becomes a de facto member of OPEC. Now, of course, if we flash back to around December 2016, OPEC and Russia and other major oil producers curb production by around 2 million barrels per day for 6 months, and that's kind of buoyed the price. So the question is, why are Moscow and Riyadh doing this? Does this all tie in with the petro-yuan ultimately? Yes, I think it very much will do. Then we have to factor in the participation of the Aramco IPO. Certainly China will be, possibly Russia to some extent. So there's all these sweeteners that effectively are going to encourage and entice Saudi Arabia to join the petro-yuan. And the question is, will other Middle Eastern nations do so, and eventually will the world adopt it? Well, the argument is eventually, of course, yes, they will. How long does this take before it becomes a significant problem? It depends on the uptake. I mean, if the volume increases 50% every few days, eventually, of course, that's not going to happen. And then we see, Western or major oil producers joining the petro-yuan and nations in the process like Saudi Arabia. Of course, eventually this headwind becomes so strong that what I said, in terms of what happens to the petro-yuan usurps the petrodollar, becomes a reality. But it's a hugely defining moment. And for me, it is the biggest single economic event that's happened in the last 75 years, even more so than taking, the US off the gold standard. I mean, ultimately, of course, at some point, there is the return of gold-backed currencies in the process for sure, but we haven't reached that point yet. We have to deal with this as it happens, in the sequence it happens. But for me, it's hugely telling, and we just have to watch what unfolds on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. But people shouldn't get overexcited too quickly. Like there's been a lot of people suggesting, oh well, the 26th of March was the death of the petrodollar. Well, ultimately, yes, but in the short, medium term, no. And China doesn't expect that to happen, and in many senses doesn't want it. It's got to be a slow growth process. And China's argument always is, if you want to trade in the petro-yuan, you're welcome to do so. We have the added advantage of backing it with gold if you're unhappy about holding yuan in the process. The choice is yours. And I think increasingly nations will rotate to that, and eventually you will see the petro-dollar usurp. And when I said the total sales of around $1.8 trillion per year, that puts it in context why this is such a seismic move when, if the petrodollar is usurped in the process.
Now, one of my questions I have, and maybe you don't know the answer, maybe you do know the answer, is the central bank controlling what is happening in China? I mean, if we move eventually to the petro-yuan and, countries start to use the petro-yuan, is this still a private Western central bank controlled system?
No, absolutely not. We have to make this clear. There's a lot of concern that, it's just the cabal moving operations to the east from the west. Absolutely not. It's the death of the cabal in totality. It's the end of that central bank influence. And there's a lot of, just maybe digressing slightly off the point, but there's a lot of concern, regarding that all these banks are Rothschild controlled, and so are the Russians. Well, if you look at what the Russian central bank has done to stimulate the Russian economy, which we're not going to go into in detail today, and look at the seismic changes that have happened in the last 15 or more years, it's clearly indicative the central bank is working to the benefit of the Russian economy and the Russian citizen. The Chinese economy, likewise, these are not Western-controlled central banks. So absolutely not. It's the death of the Western central banking controlling influence over a myriad of things, not just the gold and silver markets and everything else that people are aware of. So no, it's a very clear distinction in that regard.
Now, and we were discussing this before the interview, the pre-interview, when everything is starting to move and we're in this transition phase over to the east, and you talked about inflation here as countries drop the petrodollar. What happens here in the United States, in Europe? What are people going to feel? What's going to happen to the economy? What happens? I mean, is it like a light switch where, one day you wake up and everything is crashed and everything's done with? Or is it a different type of scenario?
Well, I think it may be it's kind of one of those things. We're already in that process. And maybe there's certain things we can talk about in terms of I generally focus on the US economy because everything else is kind of a microcosm of that. But I think in very simple terms, let's look at some of the realities. And apologies for people who are already aware of this, but I always cater for the fact that we don't know who's listening. But if we look, a country logically is said to have a trade surplus if it exports exceed its imports, and a trade deficit if it's vice versa. Positive net sales generally contribute to a current account surplus, and negative net sales abroad generally contribute to a current account deficit. Now, the US projected twin deficits will be the largest outside of a recession, namely the current account deficit and the fiscal deficit. And in the last two recessions, the US deficit rose by about 5 to 8% of GDP, meaning if the US has a recession in the literal sense, even though really from my perspective, it hasn't been out of a recession for the last 10 years, but if it happens within the next 3 years, the US deficit is likely to be around 15% of GDP. Now, what does this mean in simple terms? The US would require finding buyers of around $3 trillion of US treasuries per year. Now, given nations are dumping dollars en masse, who's going to buy them and at what rate? So why we're in the middle of this is look at the US debt. It's risen to over 21 trillion. The deficit jumped to around 720 billion. And we're only effectively 5 or 6 months into the financial calendar. The debt to GDP has risen to 105%, and the US is heading for a balance of payments crisis, which is going to culminate in a real debt default via the revaluation of gold in the future. We've seen this week the US has had to effectively sell nearly $300 billion of US debt. And then it's also threatening a trade war with its largest creditor, China, which is quite ridiculous. And this is despite it being the largest debt issuance as well since the 2008 financial crisis. Trump's added around $1 trillion of debt over the last 6 months, and this $1 trillion debt increase has only happened once before, surprisingly at the height of the 2009 global financial crisis. So the US national debt appears to be increasing almost parabolically, and yet the media remains completely silent on this, doesn't seem to be aware of any risks it posed to the dollar, financial markets, and the US and global economy. We also have to take note of the significance of the rising yield of the 10-year US Treasury. Never mind the underlying economic carnage. But, if the 10-year US Treasury yield was to rise to 4% in the next 6 months or so, that's going to massively impact the US stock market, which will cause a fall maybe 30, 40%. And that will result in this further sharp slowing of the US economy. And bear in mind that in reality as well, the US economy, as I said, has been in permanent recession since 2008. I think official figures inflate the true value of GDP by as much as 5% per year. Now, the 10-year US Treasury yield rose to 2.95% lately, which is the highest level since I think it was around January 2014. And it's close to this 3% where there's an anticipation that fireworks might commence. Now, the issue is, I think there's going to be some resistance at this kind of 3% level, until, short-term yields on, say, the 2-year, which will then require the 10-year yield to rise further to attract more buyers. However, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon and sharper than perhaps people imagine. And in the long term, the Treasury market faces a serious challenge because you're going to have this flood of Treasury securities being issued to fund these ballooning deficits, assuming anyone wants to buy them, and that's a separate matter. And in the process, we can expect further large dumpings of US Treasuries by existing holders, and the derivative machinery is going to come under further strain. So effectively, the writing's already on the wall, and there's nothing that can be done to stop this inevitable implosion. This is not sensationalism. This is reality. And I think then we have to factor in LIBOR rates. 3-month, US dollar LIBOR has risen for 37 straight days now. That's the longest consecutive streak of rises since 2005. So it even surpasses what happened during, the financial crisis in 2008. If anyone's not sure what LIBOR means, it's the London Interbank Offered Rate, and it's the average of interest rates estimated by leading banks in London that would be charged if it were to borrow from other banks. Now, the 3-month US dollar LIBOR interest rate, obviously in that respect, is the rate at which banks in London are prepared to lend to one another in US dollars with a maturity of 3 months. Now, we've seen current interest rates, even from the 8th of March, it was about 2.07%. It's now 2.31% in the space of 3 weeks. Now, why is this a major problem? Well, at the end of the day, there are about $350 trillion of financial products and loans tied to LIBOR. So, for example, leverage loans or interest rate swaps or mortgages. So rising funding cost is going to cause utter mayhem in the markets. Now, what are the causes of this? I think there's uncertainty in US monetary policy. You've got elevated credit risk with credit default swaps at banks. I think you've got demand for funds for preparation for market stress. And clearly within the banking system, there's huge dollar liquidity issues, which seems to be only getting worse and worse. So when we talk about what's going to be the impact, we're already in the midst of this impact. We're already seeing this kind of meltdown in economic reality as opposed to the economic illusion. And we could talk about aspects and drill down into the US housing market. And we don't need to cover that today because it would take too long. And I think it detracts from other points we can discuss. But what we've just highlighted is indicative of the reality. So we're already in the midst of this. The fact that we have a financial reset and we have the end of the petrodollar, it would just merely be a tipping point. The question will be, okay, is the US economy and the US banks in the process going to collapse before this much vaunted reset happens? Well, that's entirely possible. So how do the Chinese react to that? That's a question for Beijing and not something we have any clear answer or definitive viewpoint on because we don't know. But we're certainly in the midst of an economic meltdown. And from my perspective, with regard to the US banks and also Western banks, the liquidity issue and their current health or lack of it is worse than at the height of the 2008 crisis. And the question is, people say, well, where did all these missing 20 trillion, 30 trillion, whatever dollars go missing? They've been used to pump the banking system since 2008, and that has cost tens of trillions of dollars. So, yeah, there's black ops and budgets used for all manner of things from money that was squirreled away. The question from my perspective is, when does this sort of cash cow of money run out to prop up these failing banks and failing economic system? I think we might be closer than we think to that. When that money's gone, when there's nothing to prop anything up anymore, because people think, oh, well, they can just keep printing tens of trillions of dollars. Well, yes, they can. But the point that is all it's going to do is create hyperinflation. And at some point, the other question that needs to be asked is, when does all this money that's being pumped into the system go out of Wall Street and into Main Street, which causes hyperinflation in the process? So we're very much down the track in that regard. And I think it's worth focusing on the major economic sort of inflection points and what's going on, because that gives us a clear indication of how the capitalist Western financial system is teetering on the edge. And why, in that respect, whilst the petro-yuan and the adoption of the petro-yuan as opposed to the petrodollar is highly interesting and highly significant in the de-dollarization process, what's actually happening inside, the financial system that is actually facilitating the death of the dollar. And one other interesting point is we've seen only recently is central banks, not from the Federal Reserve, but Western central banks have shifted $500 billion out of dollars into the euro. Now, I'm not suggesting that I think the euro is a great, strong currency. I think that's a separate discussion for another time, perhaps. But it's indicative that central banks are starting to get nervous about the relative merits of holding dollars. I think that's a clear indication that things are cratering. So it's a kind of this huge sort of storm of current events that's all leading to the death and destruction of the dollar in the process.
So while all this is going on, I mean, we have Trump pushing tariffs with China. You see it all over the corporate media about trade wars, and he's setting up bilateral trades with many different countries. Is he looking to, fix the economy, with what we have now, or is he doing something completely different? I mean, what is your take on why he's doing this right now?
Well, there's a couple of schools of thought that says, well, there's some method in the madness of these trade tariffs, and then there's the other school of thought that says, this is highly unwise and quite a reckless perspective. And until I see to the contrary, for me, it's a bit of a reckless move because, what I think was interesting is there's all this been toing and froing, and China have expressed concerns, and Trump, carries on and has talked about, putting $60 billion into the melting pot with regards to putting tariffs on Chinese products. But I think China sent a clear signal to Trump that the imposition of trade tariffs is wholly unacceptable. And one of the reasons was there was a filing in terms of Blackstone. Now, that's an investment firm that's founded by Steven Schwarzman, who happens to be an associate of Trump. And the Chinese sovereign wealth fund sold its entire near 10% stake in the company. Now, there are people saying that suggests this sale's been in the making for a period of time. Arguably, maybe that's true. And it was merely a move by Beijing to invest in its own domestic markets or shift, that stake of money somewhere else. But whatever the reality of the Trump administration's concerns, the problem is, I think when you have a blockade of legitimate investment, it's only going to further isolate the US on the world stage. Foreign investors are going to seeking to utilize US treasuries to pay for acquisitions will be blocked, and eventually they'll be limited on bond redemptions. And I think even the US staunchest allies will lose patience and begin to isolate the US in the process. Now, there are some significant developments because it depends what action China decides to take. But one development is in terms of soybean. Now, in terms of soybeans, I think there's around 300,000 farmers across 30 states in the US. Now, a trade war could seriously undermine this industry. And put it quite simply, it can put around $27 billion of trade with China at a serious risk. Now, there is a feeling that China could retaliate by targeting the US soybean industry. It exports, I think, around 65 million tons in 2017. And soybeans contribute more to agricultural exports than any other project. Now, the question, therefore, is, that's bad enough. But there are fears that even if China said, we'll waiver putting tariffs on soybeans, but in 2017, the US has been overtaken by Brazil as China's biggest source of soybean exports. And of course, that's given rise to fears. China may seek to export more from Brazil at the expense of to import more from Brazil at the expense of the US itself. And if action was taken against US soybean producers, other major producers such as India and Argentina are going to be ready to take up the slack in the process. And I think the fact that the Beijing Foreign Ministry has explicitly stated that China will take retaliatory measures against the United States in the event of new tariffs imposed on China products suggest, that, and also that they're firmly opposed to any unilateral protectionist measures in trade. It's obviously going to harm US interests, and China will take necessary measures to protect its own interests. And what is increasingly likely is China will simply not tolerate such measures, and it's going to play a strong economic hand. And when we talk, about this event-driven scenario, we may have just seen a point where there might be a major acceleration in Beijing deciding to press this much vaunted reset button. I really think it has the potential for that. China still wants to sit down and mediate the problem and resolve it. So there's willing on the Chinese side to do this. If that's not food and enough sort of food for thought, what happens that Washington may want to give consideration to the fact that China may well just pull the plug on those $250 billion of MOUs that they signed with when obviously Xi went to Florida to meet Trump. Now that could contribute significantly to the US economy in a negative or a positive way. They may just dump a huge slice of US treasuries. And what's ironic is the very businesses that might have benefited from this proposed $250 billion of trade deals could also be the very same businesses which are hit indirectly by Trump's trade tariffs. Now, it's too early to say, I think, at this point exactly, but the gamble Trump is taking, I don't think is looking like a prudent decision. But we need to see how everything unfolds. And people may say, well, actually, at the end of the day, China really doesn't care about the trade tariff. And I think China would quite happily try to readdress some of the imbalance in that trade deficit. But I think waging war with your biggest creditor is never a wise move. And frankly, I think there are better, more intelligent ways to sit down with the Chinese and say, look, we have problems. We recognize there's this imbalance. What can we do to address it? But also the other question comes about is the thorny subject of, well, Trump was all, in his election campaign for reinvigorating, the US internal market and having this huge infrastructure spend, which he said was $1 trillion, which is probably more like 4 or 5. Who's going to pay for this? Well, you might want to keep the Chinese on side because they might be a way of actually paying for this huge redevelopment and reindustrialization. And, you'd want to keep China on side because I think it's great to get Chinese businesses to work inside the US economy and to, buy up businesses, develop businesses and stimulate the manufacturing base that the US desperately needs. Bearing in mind, if the US has a devalued dollar because it quite simply doesn't have any gold to back its currency, then it desperately needs a strong internal market. Otherwise, hyperinflation is going to be a major problem if it's still dependent hugely on exports. So for me, this is a massive problem. And I'm not sure anyone's really thinking through this to the end, to the sort of bitter end of what it would, the consequences of it. But some may argue, well, equally, it doesn't matter because the dollar's going to die. The US economy is going to go into meltdown. In a way, this will usurp and destroy the cabal's economic and financial base, and that is really the be and end all of this. So, really, does it matter in the long run? Now, that is an argument on, but from my perspective, it will be far better to try and put some measures in place which helps the US mitigate this hugely bumpy ride. That's being diplomatic in the foreseeable future, rather than just going, well, it doesn't matter, let's have scorched earth and worry about the consequences later. So it is a calculated gamble. Maybe it'll work for Trump, maybe it won't. But from my perspective, I don't think it's a great idea. And I'm already sensing that some people inside the US administration going, do you know what, maybe we need to back off from this. Maybe this is not a great idea. Because, if we put tariffs on Chinese products, what's it going to do to the internal US market? It's just going to cause the cost of living to rise proportionately based on these tariffs. So who's going to be hit in the end? The average US citizen. So what's it going to do to the US economy? It's going to damage it in the process. That's in very simple terms. So we'll see what unfolds, but I really don't, on face value, a trade war with any nation is never a great idea. No one wins. But when you do it with your biggest creditor, and China has all the economic weapons to throw back at the US if it so chooses to do so, is a hugely unwise move.
Now, I wanted to switch gears. I wanted to go out to North Korea and talk about what is happening out there. We know that Kim Jong-un went up to China to meet with Xi. Trump is saying that, everything, I guess, went well with those talks. And, what we're seeing in North Korea is they're getting prepared for some type of peace summit. Now, what happened out in North Korea? I mean, 1 minute the corporate media was telling us that we were going to war, that North Korea was going to fire a nuclear weapon at the United States, and the next minute Trump comes out and says we're headed towards peace. We've spoke to representatives and it looks like things are being ironed out. What is your take on what is happening out in North Korea?
Right, there's a huge there's another one of those big sections to discuss and how we have to take a few steps back. I think the first thing, as I said earlier, this was one of those sort of catalytic events as a result of Putin's speech to lawmakers regarding Russia's military superiority. But if we take a step back, there was this strong desire from the US in the face of this perceived aggression of North Korea about implementing sanctions. But the reality is it didn't fool anyone. Large parts of the world saw this as an act of a desperation by the US, whose presence on the foreign world stage is I'm sorry to say this, people may not like this, but it's becoming more and more irrelevant. China was now regarded as the major player, and that's restricted the US's ability to apply real pressure. Washington actually had to also water down sanctions, and that was bad enough. But as I've said previously, China and Russia made it abundantly clear some time ago to Washington that any attempt at launching preemptive strikes on Pyongyang would be met with this devastating military response, and also likely an economic response, which the latter is obviously in the case of China. So it meant they had to back off, which obviously infuriated elements within the US administration, the US military to a lesser extent, and most certainly the capitalists or deep state inside Washington. Now, we heard Nikki Haley state at the UN that the US would act alone if Kim Jong-un's regime didn't stop testing missiles and bombs. Well, China responded very publicly, stating they would never allow conflict or a war on the peninsula, which affirms exactly what we understood some time ago was the private line between Beijing and Washington. Now, I think on the very first interview we did, Dave, on X22, we talked about why war would never happen. And subsequently, everything we said back then has come to fruition. So China's in no mood to tolerate any US unilateral aggression, and they will respond in kind. That course of action takes place, as will Russia. Now, the thing is, one thing with China is they don't respond well to threats or intimidation by anyone, but especially not the US. And, so the argument is if there was any sort of aggression with regards to North Korea, China can once again deliver the knockout punch to the US dollar in the process. But I think it's perhaps the clearer, most damning example of how the cabal are impaling themselves on their own sword in the process, because they started off with this high octane rhetoric of wanting to go to war, and it was never on the cards from my perspective. We laid this out previously, and it's proved, as we said, to be the case. Now, let's fast forward to where we are now. We witnessed this huge seismic shift in North and South Korea relations. And it's something we also forecasted would happen, where many of us suggested the war was the only option. And obviously, the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, he sent a presidential delegation to Pyongyang, and where senior officials from Seoul met with Kim Jong-un. This is going back a few weeks ago, and other major North Korean politicians. Now, Kim Jong-un confirmed what we've said all along, that he wants to stand firm to advance North-South relations and write a new history of national reunification by all efforts that was possible. Now, this is another thing we talked about, reunification. People said this is impossible. It'll never happen. Well, it is going to happen. When is it going to happen? I can't say, but if I was a betting man, I would say in the next year or two, we'll see huge strides forward in that regard. And now, the other thing I think that's worth mentioning is there was this idea that Kim Jong-un was approaching this from a position of weakness. And despite all the rhetoric to the contrary and suggesting it is weakness, North Korea approached the South from a position of renewed military strength. And the irony is, and perhaps this will shock people, despite sanctions, North Korea has a rapidly growing economy in which standards of living are rising. That is reality. It may shock people, many people may not want to believe that, but it's true. And it's precisely why North Korea conducted tests in recent months with missile and nuclear tests, because it laid the foundations for them to approach the South with a realistic chance of succeeding in reunification and peace talks. And it also proves that nations are now resourceful and capable of bypassing US-led sanctions. And this is something Washington likes to keep implementing, but they just can't wrap their head around the fact that it's not reality anymore, that it doesn't work. And people may find it surprising, but North Koreans are largely very loyal to the political system, whatever reservations we might have ourselves. And I think what's most telling is that the rapprochement between the North and South Korea was actually at the instigation of Pyongyang, and it had absolutely nothing to do with Washington exerting any influence. The decision by Pyongyang to extend this kind of olive branch to the South was, in essence, as we said, largely taken independently. But there were lengthy discussions with both the Chinese and the Russians in that regard. Now, the question is, what's the makeup of this reunification? Well, that remains to be seen. I think it's possible that Korea, as a country which has maybe one legal international representative, maybe one foreign policy, one trade policy, perhaps with differing political systems initially, but there's going to be this huge desire to distribute national wealth according to the needs of the various regions of the reunified country. And arguably, the northern regions were going to need more economic assistance than the south. The problem is the stumbling blocks to overcome. And ultimately, it will lead to the removal of US military bases and their presence in South Korea. It has to happen after all. In a unified Korea, technically, you'd see US weapons next door to China, and that's not going to happen in any way, shape, or form. So what does exactly Washington do now in light of these developments? Because I don't think either the North or the South is going to let the US intervene in what I call this tectonic shift in relations. Now, to some extent, relations between Washington and Seoul have become strained, not in least because South Korea, ironically, is upset with these trade disputes with the trade administration with regards to tariffs. Another example of why putting trade tariffs in place is not a great idea. I think there's no doubt South Korea is more advanced in terms of wanting to embrace the multipolar world than many might believe. But I think a really telling point was when Pyongyang officials stated that they would not need a nuclear deterrent if it had international security guarantees, and that North Korea is happy to freeze missile and nuclear tests during the course of future talks with, yes, none other than the United States. And what was very telling is we've had from all sorts of myriads of Western media sources about what an idiot and Kim Jong-un is. Well, remember when Putin was correct, I think, in asserting that Kim Jong-un was indeed intelligent, because his brinkmanship, his diplomacy and olive branches extended to the South meant effectively he'd thrown this huge curveball into the US neocon court, and he exposed their rhetoric and true intentions. Because the argument's always been from the sort of cabal deep state angle that whilst the US or those elements were claimed they sought peace, they've done everything to impose conditions that made this impossible. And in essence, the US desire to preserve the North Korean bogeyman is to justify arms sales to South Korea, as we said in our first interview, and antagonize China and Russia in the region. But now it's got a four-pronged assault via Russia, China, South Korea and North Korea, and to some extent even now Japan. So the US is going to have to make some serious concessions, or what are they going to do? Continue with this ridiculously false narrative that will continue to present North Korea as a rogue state who has no desire to seek peace and reconciliation with its neighbors? Well, recent developments prove that's a nonsense. And they've, in essence, Pyongyang's gone out of its way, I think, beyond the call of duty. And in the process, Kim Jong-un has proved to be a grandmaster chess player. And rather like Iran, the threat of nuclear technology was nothing more than a ruse to get others to the negotiating table. Why? Because it was a view to isolate the US's position in the region. It's exactly what Iran did. It's exactly what North Korea did. So the question is, what's going to happen in the upcoming summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump? How exactly is Washington going to respond? Well, I think certainly the eyes of the world are going to be upon them. I think there's no doubt they're going to attempt to sell this as a soft power victory and that they brought North Korea to heel. Well, that is absolutely not the case. The reality is the US were told, as we said, that a military option was never on the cards by both China and Russia. And we said this back in August on the first X-22 interview. But ultimately, of course, the unification of two Koreas is the end of the capitalist influence in the region, and yet another huge hammer blow to their failed aspirations for the world. I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail about the recent meeting between Xi and obviously Kim Jong-un, because it's something I'm covering off for our podcast subscribers in great detail, and it'd be very unfair to put that out on the X-22 before I've even discussed it with Dan. It is a hugely seismic moment. There are a lot of geopolitical reasons for it. The timing, as ever, is extremely prescient, and it's certainly ultimately designed to put a huge amount of pressure on the US to come to heel with regards to North Korea, and to realize that the days of having any military presence there are rapidly running out. And they're going to have to play ball, because if North Korea and South Korea are The Japanese are starting to come round. The Russian and the Chinese have been supportive. The US can't be seen to continue with the old rhetoric. And because it just simply won't wash in the world anymore. I think there's talk that perhaps Trump might want to postpone the meeting with Kim Jong-un because the US has lost a lot of effectively face with regards to North Korea because they came out with all guns blazing in inverted commas with regards to North Korea a long time ago, made a lot of threatening overtures. And all of a sudden, the US is now having to sit back and go, well, we're actually going to have to entertain now having a meeting with Kim Jong-un. He's not the idiot we portrayed to the world. And he's going to come along with a very sensible, balanced viewpoint as to why he, what proposed to do nuclear testing and missile testing. It was because of the threat he felt that the US posed. But I think the one thing that is extremely interesting is the first time Kim Jong-un has left North Korea. What that says to me is despite efforts to implement regime change, it's pretty obvious he was confident to leave the country, knowing that when he went back 3 days later, he would still be the leader. That suggests that infiltration inside the Korean government doesn't exist, in the North Korean government, which there was a lot of reports that, in fact, there was infiltration and there was attempts to implement regime change. That's simply off the table. So there's upcoming summits between North and South Korea. There's one proposed between North Korea and Japan, and of course, sandwiched in between is this much vaunted meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. I think it'd be fascinating. We'll see what the outcome is. But I think it's going to be quite a humbling experience for Trump and for the US administration. And because in essence, if he does everything they say they want him to do, we want you to denuclearize, and he does, and he plays ball with them. In the process, they get the reunification. What can the US do? They've got nothing to leverage at it. That's where he's been intelligent, and that's why everything that North Korea's done and Kim Jong-un's done in the last year or so is highly intelligent, and it was really just taking a page out of the Russian playbook in terms of moving, chess pieces around the board, and they forced the issue, which is going to work to their advantage. It resolves a major problem in the Korean Peninsula in terms of the risk that, and war at one point, the irony is people talked about war, and I said this back in August, the big risk of war was around about a year ago when there was a serious risk. It could have escalated and blown out of all proportion. After that, that went away, and that was the beginning of this big, huge change in mentality and attitude to how we resolve the North Korean question. And, it's early days yet, but I'm very optimistic that, the risks are behind us and we can move forward and see a peaceful resolution to Korea. And I do expect Korean unification within probably a year or two's time, which some people say, well, that's way too quick. But it's entirely possible. I mean, East and West Germany reunified. It doesn't mean you've resolved the problems overnight. There is going to be a transition and a kind of recalibration and stabilizing period in time. But I think essentially the nuts and bolts, in a very broad sense, will be completed within that time frame. But it remains to be seen. But the ultimate thing is it's a big, huge hammer blow and a total failure for the cabal deep state. And that's, for me, is one of the most encouraging developments because North Korea clearly is a huge flashpoint, or was, as we said, 12 months ago, and going back for years prior to that.
So the cabal, they've lost out with North Korea. I mean, they tried to do something there, and probably they tried to bring us to war. The same thing in Syria. It looks like Russia and Syria, they have complete control of the country, and they're sweeping through the country, getting rid of the Islamic State, getting rid of al-Nusra, getting rid of al-Qaeda. The funding from Trump has stopped to the moderate rebels. The funding for the Kurds has been discontinued. And do you see the same thing happening out in Syria where, the deep state was embedded, they were pushing to remove Assad, and now the table has turned and basically they're on the losing end, just like in North Korea? Do you think there's going to be a time where the troops, that are in Syria and also the troops that are in Iraq, they're going to be leaving that area?
Yeah, I think ultimately they will.
We spent, and I was against it from the beginning. They try and say, well, maybe not. I was against it from the beginning. And by the way, we're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon. Very soon we're coming out. We're going to have 100% of the caliphate, as they call it, sometimes referred to as land. We're taking it all back quickly. But we're going to be coming out of there real soon. Going to get back to our country, where we belong, where we want to be. But just think of it. We spent, as of 3 months ago, $7 trillion, not billion, not million, 7 trillion with a T. Nobody ever heard of the word trillion until 10 years ago. We spent $7 trillion in the Middle East. We'd build a school, they'd blow it up. We'd build it again, they'd blow it up. We'd build it again.
I think recently we saw a clear attempt, and I think this came out as a backdrop to the whole Putin episode about the military superiority of Russia, where clearly there was an attempt to create a huge chemical weapons attack, probably in East Ghouta in Syria. And that's why we saw this massive escalation and an attempt by the Syrians and the Russians to remove the militants and the so-called rebels out of East Ghouta. And unfortunately, the US were thwarting at every end and turn to prevent that. But the Syrians and the Russians prevailed. What did they find in the process? Massive quantities of chemical weapons materials. There is no doubt that there was an intention to create a chemical false flag attack, which the Russian and Syrian intelligence got wind of. They prevented it. Why would it have happened? It was to try and implicate Assad once again, as though Assad, who effectively controls 98% of Syrian territory, all the important towns and villages are now under his control. He's got all the support of the Syrian people, but no, he just wants to go and launch a chemical attack. Well, it's absolute nonsense. But the reason is it was for the US to justify attacking Assad forces. And of course, what did the Russians say to the Americans? Look, we've reached a point now. We have military superiority. And as far as we're concerned, our forces are embedded inside the Syrian Assad forces, which they have been ever since Russia went in. Russia actually coordinates all the military operations from Moscow, which is probably something people aren't aware of, but that's reality. And they said to the Americans, fine, here's the deal. If you attack the Assad forces, as far as we're concerned, you are attacking us as well. And we are not going to tolerate that. We will take retaliatory action, as they said to the Americans in North Korea. And the Americans backed off. East Ghouta has nearly been liberated. And I think, it was an important key strategic city where they tried to implement another attempt to frame Assad and then launch preemptive strike and try and start a war again. It hasn't worked for them. I think it's probably the last futile attempt. I think attempts inside northern Syria have largely failed. The Turkish are now in ascendancy. I think at some point there's going to be some negotiated settlement with the Turks and the Syrians with regards to what happened. So yeah, it's a law of diminishing influence for the US in terms of whatever their motivation was, which initially was to remove Assad. I think they realized that was never going to happen. So then it was, well, okay, maybe we can carve an enclave through northern Syria, which would take us all the way to Lebanon in the east and the Mediterranean Sea, hence why there was that attempt to destabilize Lebanon, which also failed. And in the process actually strengthened Hezbollah inside the Lebanese parliament and unified the Lebanese parliament, stopped the civil war. So all these events that they've tried to instigate these changes have failed. And now the prospect of creating this enclave have diminished to virtually nothing. So what does that leave the US with? What are they exactly defending anymore? Who are they backing? And what is the point of this? Well, largely it's become an irrelevance. So yes, at some point, the US will withdraw troops from Iraq and Syria. I don't know when it's going to happen. And at this point, nobody really knows, but it's a reality. But it's going to be a very humiliating withdrawal because simply it's an admission of complete failure in terms of foreign policy. And everybody knows what the US intent was to remove Assad from power, and it's failed. And the fact is that at some point there's going to be all the repercussions to it to do with who was arming, the rebels, who was in fact ultimately arming Daesh, and there's all sorts of reports to that suggest that the US was assisting Daesh operatives getting out of hot spots inside Syria when, the Syrian armed forces were in the ascendancy. There's also questions as to who exactly the US was and NATO partners were arming in the process. I think this will all come out in the wash in the end because Russian intelligence has that information. People always underestimate the Russians. Their intelligence is probably arguably second to no one in the world. And they pretty much know everything that's happening everywhere all at the same time. The one thing that surprises people is they don't always play their hand. They're very clever at saying, we'll use this as leverage. There's plenty of things they know inside Syria which they've used as leverage, which ultimately has assisted Assad in the process. And why play your hand? Because once you've played your hand, you've got nothing left to give. And therefore, all the leverage and advantage that offers is gone. So that's why they don't do it. There's no point in playing the hand. But periodically they will do. But Putin's speech, and we come back to this, to the lawmakers in Moscow about military superiority, was effectively their red line. They were drawing a line under everything, saying we are no longer going to tolerate, US interference inside Syria. We're not going to tolerate it in North Korea. And I think it's worth mentioning also Iran again, because Iran always keeps figuring. We know the Trump administration is looking to exit the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. There's talk they want to implement more sanctions on them. There's certain concerns with regards to the likes of Bolton coming on because he's always been very anti-Iran, and people believe, well, there's a risk of war happening with the Iranians. From my perspective, absolutely not. It would be a suicide mission for any nation that attempted to go to a war with Iran, be it Israel, be it Saudi Arabia, or the US, or a combination. Any of these new nations who do it, it will be effectively a Waterloo moment for them. And it will have serious blowback consequences. Do I think there's a risk of trying to overthrow Tehran government again? Yes, I think that's a possibility. We saw it happen earlier this year and it fizzled out pretty quickly. Doesn't mean it won't be tried again. I think there is a desire to do so. I think there is a backdrop where there is definitely a need for some internal reform in Iran. I think the Tehran government recognizes this and there's a need to do it. And that's basically how they're trying to fuel what I would term definitely a Western-backed attempt to overthrow Tehran. I think there's a risk that could happen or an attempt to do it. But if they do, it will get very ugly, but it will be ugly for whoever's involved in it. So if the US has got any sense, they're going to walk away from this and not get involved in a conflict with Iran. It remains to be seen what happens, and we have to wait what Bolton's influence may or may not be with regards to Iran, what potentially Saudi Arabia may want to do with regards to Iran. There's sort of rumblings that there's people within inside the House of Saudi who are keen to affect the regime change there. I don't know whether that's reality or not. And then, of course, Israel's always grumbling about the fact of the nuclear deal and sanctioning the Iranians, but they never go as far as ever wanting to get in direct conflict, because the truth is, anyone who goes to war with Iran, it would be absolute insanity. And there's two other big reasons why this is the case. Russia has their back militarily, China has their back economically. And at the moment, the last thing you want to do is start meddling with the Russians and the Chinese in that regard.
So since the cabal, the deep state, their backs are against the wall, they're losing in North Korea, Syria, Iran, they might try something there. I mean, do you see anything else that they might attempt to do? I mean, we had the Parkland event here in the United States to distract, and that was in the news cycle. Do you see them doing something much larger where it would be one gigantic distraction?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the gun control issues is an interesting thing because, look, I mean, I'm from the UK. Clearly, we don't possess guns, and we haven't had the right to bear arms for a long time. So it's a very different perspective. What I would say, and this is my personal opinion, I don't have problems with people with owning guns. I think during times of peace, relatively, it's not an issue. The only concern I would have in terms of gun ownership is if suddenly we have societal breakdown, then that becomes a problem. But I think the one thing, if there is a cabal desire with regards to gun control, they know full well gun control is never going to happen in the US. What are you going to do? Decide to suddenly remove 100? I don't know how many hundreds of millions of firearms that the American population own. That is never going to happen. What they're trying to do is use gun control as a way of dividing and conquering the American people. And there's unfortunately people in the alternative media who are fueling this as a left and right issue. It isn't. It is just a divisive measure by the cabal to try and divide and conquer the American people, because they know in reality they can't enforce gun control. It won't happen. But if they can divide and conquer the American people, that is what the whole aim is. That's what the political system tries to do when it's an illusion. Democrats and the Republicans, it's changed with Trump in as the president. But prior to that, they were no different. It's just an illusion. It's a way to engage people, frustrate them, upset them, and divide them. And that's exactly what the push is in terms of gun control in the US. It's not a reality. Now, are the risks? There's always this idea of, is there a risk of false flag attacks happening? Yeah, there is a risk they're going to happen. But from my perspective, every time something now happens in the US, it's just waking more and more people up to the reality of what is going on. The narrative falls apart very quickly. It's like, we've got time today to talk about the Skripal case in the UK. They contradict themselves. They get these key players in place that contradict themselves. And in the end, all it's doing is making people in nations go, hang on, I'm not buying this narrative anymore. It's breaking down. It doesn't make sense. And it becomes a bit of a 5-day wonder. And I think, there might be some demonstrations against, gun ownership. But I think rather like always happens, eventually it dies a death and it goes quiet. But it's all part of an attempt and a divisive measure to divide and conquer nations. That is all it's to do with. It's not, that's the end goal. Why? Because the cabal know they're finished. What's the only thing they can do in retreat? It's what they always do. They just want to wreck every nation or wreck anything they can in the process. So they can divide and conquer the American people and destroy the US in that regard. Then, to some capacity, that's precisely what they'll do. In a broader sense, I think increasingly we're seeing less and less chance of false flag events. We just explained what happened in Syria. I think there was a push certainly a few months ago, and I think we covered this off previously, where there was an attempt to frame Iran for some event in the Middle East. That also failed because intelligence prevented it. I think the MO is very restrictive with the cabal. They're very much what's called a one ponies. They never are very capable of being very incisive or intuitive or inventive in terms of what they do. It's always the same process. And they're getting found out, and increasingly it's getting harder and harder for them to implement these kind of false flag events, which has any substance or teeth anymore. I wouldn't rule it out definitively, but I see it less of a problem now than even when we spoke in January. I think from the US perspective, the alternative media needs to stop framing everything in terms of the Democrats and the Republicans, stop framing everything in terms of Trump, and and losing the reality that this is all just trying to be divisive. It's designed to just divide and conquer American people on any grounds they can. Don't fall for this narrative. Don't get sucked into this, because it's doing is giving them more ammunition to throw at the American people. And it's the same anyway. We have the same political system in the UK designed to do exactly the same. It serves no purpose for the average American people. Nothing changes in the political system and never has, as it doesn't happen in the UK. So I think that's the important thing. And I wish people in the alternative media would do less of this and actually say, okay, what's the reality? What are they really trying to push here? Can they affect the kind of change they think or they try to convey to people they can? No. What is the real reality? And try and galvanize the people in the process and make them realize that is the real motivation. And it always has been. Because the one thing the cabal they can never win if a nation is galvanized and in the process of saying, no, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We're going to have a united front with regards to matters. It's the one thing that they will recoil, and it terrifies them. So that's why they will do everything to push these agendas, because it's the old adage, united we stand, divided we fall, and that's precisely what they've done historically in nations for for longer than I think any of us care to remember.
Paul, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work? How can people see your podcast?
Well, okay. Well, first off, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure as ever to be on, and we look forward to coming on in the future. In terms of, obviously, we have the website, which is thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. In terms of the podcast subscription, if you go, there's a link on the front page. It costs $4.75 a month. You get roughly, well, you do get 5 podcasts equivalent a week. They're roughly 10 to 15 minutes each, and they are very densely packed information. There's no waffle in it. It's very much the point. It's intelligence. It's analysis. I mean, it's basically what we've covered today is a very small proportion of what we cover in terms of the podcast. It covers everything globally. It's geopolitical, it's financial, and it's to give people an insight into what exactly is going on. And our track record speaks for itself. We get a lot of forecasts correct. We have a very good understanding of what is going on geopolitically, financially, and what's happening in the world. And we love people to subscribe. We make it very cheap because we believe we want to get a lot of people in to subscribe rather than making it more expensive and reducing the audience. And it helps us because it gives us, the opportunity to develop what we're doing. We're not trying to make a huge fortune out of it, but that's not the point. But we do need to, increase our subscription base, of course. We tried to do things in other ways and we just couldn't do it with YouTube. They just blocked us immediately and we weren't able to do that. So that's why we went through the subscription route. But we really would, appreciate people subscribing, and we thank everyone who has subscribed. We get a lot of positive feedback, and we enjoy doing it. We've got over nearly 380 podcasts now. I said to you, Dave, before we came on, it's equivalent. Now we estimate, based on the time, around 700,000 page novels. That's how much information is in. And if you really want to, you can access every single podcast from the first one to the last one. We have actually had odd people who've done that, which sounds incredible, but they did go back and listen to all of them. But we have the website, of course, where we could put a lot of free material. There's well over 100 articles on there, and we have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, and there's a Facebook group. We don't use that to a huge extent. Never mind recent developments with Facebook aside, but yeah, and we just thank you, Dave, for getting us on the X22. It's always a pleasure, and it's great to be on again.
Yes, thank you for being on here. I really appreciate you taking the time and telling us, what's been happening financially and geopolitically. Thank you very much once again for being on the Spotlight. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Cryptocurrency News Channel. Your new future. Thank you. Follow us on YouTube.